Hello and welcome to the Non-Perfect Parents Club podcast. I'm Emma, a mama of two girls, an ex-nursery practitioner and the creator of the Non-Perfect Parents Club. The Non-Perfect Parents Club is all about support, honesty, truths, acknowledging that none of us can be perfect parents because it's impossible, and basically just speaking the unspoken. The only rule here is no judgment allowed. I love hearing people's stories. I love finding out about other parents, their family dynamics, their values and how they tick. So that is what this podcast is going to be. Some great honest conversations about parenting, hopefully delving into some nitty-gritty thoughts and feelings that will make us all laugh, cry and sigh a big sigh of relief. Hello and welcome back to the Non-Perfect Parents Club podcast. This is the first episode in a new series, This Is My Story, where parents can share their experiences of certain situations, to raise awareness, to offer support for other parents experiencing the same or similar, and, as always, to give parents a voice. Today's guest would like to remain anonymous, so if you do recognise their voice, please respect their request for to remain anonymous. Hi, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me. First of all, would you like to tell us your reason for sharing your story?
Hiya. Yeah, I've got a few reasons really. The first, I guess, is to raise awareness of the situation that we found ourselves in, because we're not alone. It was a really difficult situation, so if I can help somebody to navigate that, then that's what I'd love this to provide. And also to encourage parents to ask questions if they find themselves in the same situation. Mm-hmm. And also because our situation was health and social care involved, I think anybody listening who works in those services, I would love to shed light on our situation, how it was for us, in the hope that practice might change or approach might change when working with parents in a similar scenario.
So let's start at the beginning.
So this all happened just over 6 years ago now. Okay. So I have two children. I have a daughter who's now 10 and a son who's nearly 7. And this related to my son. So, and I guess before I start, the reason I should have said before, the reason I wanted to stay anonymous wasn't because, I'm happy to share my story, and if people recognise my voice, that's absolutely fine. But only a few close friends and family know the story so far. It's not something I've broadcast. But I just didn't feel able to be kind of a spokesperson or a contact person for people going through this. But I hope that the tips will, or sharing my story will help people. I just wanted to say that first. But yeah, it relates to my son. When he was a baby, he was about 3 months old, we noticed a mark on his back. Mm-hmm. So it was really quite faint, but it was on his lower back, and we thought we were just bathing him and we didn't know what it was. So next day I took him along to see our GP, and our GP saw him, said, "Oh, it could be a birthmark, but I'm not sure because it's not usual presentation. Yeah. I'd suggest you go to hospital, to the paediatric ward." So I'm not going to mention names of professionals, or because I don't think that's helpful. No. And I think practice has changed since. But we went to the hospital. And on the paediatric ward, I saw a junior doctor who assessed us, and within an hour, they were talking about instigating a child protection procedure, Section 47, call it. I was on my own with my son at the time, so it was all a bit bewildering. Yeah. They wondered if it was a non-accidental injury, is what they call it. Because he was a baby, non-mobile, he couldn't move about himself, he couldn't have done it himself, and it looked like a bruise, ultimately. So it was kind of bluey, purple, and they wondered, the next, one of the more senior staff members came in and thought it looked like a hand mark, because it was kind of several lines. So I have worked in the NHS within child mental health services and have been involved in safeguarding procedures. So I know that these things happen, as in if they're not sure, you have to follow procedure.
Yeah.
I completely understand that, and I was actually kind of okay at the beginning, thinking it'll get sorted out pretty soon, but they need to do this. And I wasn't angry about that particularly, but I was shocked, but I wasn't. I understood it. But really, what followed was a lot of things that I wouldn't have wanted to happen in the way that it happened. And actually, my view is that a lot of it could have been prevented. It was a huge waste of resources for me, and a lot of stress and anxiety. So what happened next was my husband was contacted and he was able to come and join us, and we were then on the ward for several hours whilst things were put in place. So we had various interactions, some helpful, most not very helpful, in quite rushed, circumstances because they were busy. People didn't always have the time to sit and explain things properly, so we were left with lots of questions and lots of fear. One of the most stressful interactions was somebody rushing in on the phone, just asking me, didn't even introduce herself, asking me information about our other child, where she was at the time, what her date of birth was, and I thought, I don't even know who you are. So basic things like introductions, and she was talking to social care, it later transpired. So she also then came in a bit later, apologised for that, but then said, is your son breastfed? And I said, yeah, we're breastfeeding. And he said, has he ever had formula? With no explanation about why she was asking me this. So then it turns out they wanted me to leave him on the ward that night without me, and I had to go home. And this was a ward not just for babies, this was a ward with adolescents who were experiencing mental health problems. And they said, we'll supervise him, we've got the nurse's bay nearby. But the supervision wasn't really adequate in my view.
And he was 3 months old.
3 months old, breastfed. And as it happened, we were there till about 1 a.m. We had to have various interviews with people, and then we only got away at 1, and I made sure I was back for 6 a.m. So, and actually he'd slept through, which was a miracle. But and I managed to get a couple of hours sleep. But that was one of the hardest bits of the process, leaving him when I knew I was breastfeeding. I was thinking, what if he wakes up? What if?
And I imagine that will have been the first time you had to leave him.
Never left him before, and then just wondering whether he was being looked after, and all the shock of what had just happened.
And you were still a new mum. Like, I know it was your second, but each time you have a baby, that you're still a new mum, aren't you? And you're going through all that.
And all the hormones and all the, because I was breastfeeding as well, I was like, the instinct was just to be close, but we were told we couldn't stay overnight because of what happened, or allegedly happened. So I made sure I went back first thing and managed to feed him, thankfully. And then we were on the ward the whole of the next day while they did more interviews, I guess, and more putting things in place. So what needed to happen next was that while they did all these assessments, so this process can take weeks, this section 47, they had to find somewhere the children could go. So we were very fortunate in that my in-laws were able to have the children, and the children were actually used to being there. They're fairly local to us. But we were, at that point, allowed to stay with them as well. But because my in-laws were there, they could supervise. So that was a bit of a relief. But that day was pretty traumatic as well. We had various people in and out. We had people taking photographs. We had a lot of people were very sensitive or non-judgemental, but some people had made up their minds, it appeared, including the senior doctor, who was very careless, I would say, in his interactions and describing us and the situation to other professionals in front of us. And yeah, it was awful. But that night, I think we went home, well, not to home, to my in-laws.
Yeah.
And I think we were there for 5 days in that current phase of this sort of assessment. By this time, we'd started to research things ourselves. So so the GP really early on had mentioned this type of birthmark called Mongolian Blue Spot. That's what it was called at the time. I've written down the official name of it now because it's changed.
Right.
It's now Congenital Dermal Melanocytosis.
Okay.
So that's the sort of medical term, because Mongolian Blue Spot is considered not appropriate because it's attributed to one particular race of people, culture, and because, and this is sort of crucial to the story though, the birthmark is usually seen in children in certain parts of Asia, and also South America, some parts of India and Africa, not often in white children. So that was one thing that threw them off. This is the story we got later. So you can guess the end of the story, that it was this birthmark. Yeah. But yeah, they thought because he was white, they disregarded it. But also the other crucial factor was because we presented a bit later than you might normally be seen at birth, or within a couple of weeks. But I think we just missed it because it was so faint. Yeah. We hadn't really seen it. But anyway, that was their explanation. So we'd started to research it ourselves. We'd noticed that this bruise wasn't really changing in nature, and a bruise would change colour. Yeah. So we tried to flag this with social care, who were involved at this point now, and with healthcare. Weren't really getting a lot of response or urgency about it. So then the story gets worse. So we were able to sort of, stay at home, but obviously we were left in this horrible limbo period, thinking, what on earth's going to happen? How long is this going to drag on for? Yeah. Because we knew we hadn't done anything, but we even started questioning ourselves. Not that we'd done anything intentionally, but maybe we've hurt him by accident. Yeah. Maybe when we were sleep deprived, we did something. Put him down too roughly. We just started racking our brains and we couldn't think of anything. We started thinking, who's held him, who's had it.
And that must have been an awful feeling, an awful position to be in, because you're not then thinking clearly at all, are you? You're trying to make sense of it all. Yeah,
and we weren't really supported in that process. Yeah. I don't feel. We had some helpful interactions with social workers who came to do an assessment visit at home, and were quite reassuring, saying, well, we can't, we know you don't have, there's no sort of history with us, he seems very happy, all of that kind of thing. But then after about 5 or 6 days maybe, we got called to an urgent meeting with social care, and again, horrible moment. We didn't know why we were being called for a meeting. We were imagining all sorts of scenarios. We were just told we had to be there within a couple of hours. So we went. We were made to wait for ages. And we took the children and our in-laws with us, and we were told that when my son had an X-ray in that initial couple of days, they'd sent it to Alder Hay, I think, for a assessment of this X-ray, and they'd found what looked like a healing fracture. So we were just floored. We were just in bits and thinking, what on earth is going on? They'd made up their minds, I feel, in that meeting, that because the phrase "this is as bad as it gets" was used, and we were just clearly devastated, and they told us that the plan would have to change, that the children would have to stay with grandparents, but we couldn't stay there. We would have to stay at home. So we were separated at that point, but we were allowed to go through 4 times a day for an hour each time so I could breastfeed him. So I'm laughing because it's ridiculous in so many ways. I mean, the whole situation is ridiculous, but as I say, part of me really wanted to be supportive and understanding because of my previous professional background. And I feel like social workers get a really hard time of it. They have a horrible job sometimes. Yeah. But in that situation, I couldn't be sympathetic. No. I was thinking, you shouldn't be speaking to us like this, actually. You should be being completely open-minded and curious. And that's a big...
So how did you feel in that moment when they told you that?
Oh, just...
Because I imagine you can still remember how you felt.
Completely baffled, completely confused, thinking I was living in some sort of alternative reality, that I didn't even... You start to think you're going mad. You think, what? Now there's this as well? Like, what on earth is happening? And, you just start to question everything. That's the biggest thing, confusion and helplessness, because you're powerless. You just don't feel like you can do anything about it or say anything at this point. And you have to think about everything you're saying because they're taking notes, they're listening. But we just kept reiterating that we had no idea, that we have no previous connection with social care, and we were, we wanted to help. We wanted to find out as well. We wanted to know what this was. So we kept reiterating that as well. We want to be on board. We want to help. So from that, we went home after that, I think, and the children went to in-laws. Yeah. Where they were fine, thankfully. They were happy. We kept lots of contact, and but we were just left even more helpless in doing our research, thinking this bruise isn't changing, trying to contact the hospital when we could, getting little information, I would say, at that point. Yeah. So in the meantime, my daughter had an assessment.
I was going to ask, how old was your daughter at that point?
She was 3.
Right, and did she just think she was going to grandparents'
So
house?
That's a really good question, because at that awful meeting with social care, we said, have you got any ideas what we could tell her, because maybe you've got experience of this sort of thing. And the suggestion was that we could tell her we were going to a party, which was unbelievable.
Wow.
I know. And because I'm of the mind that we needed to involve her as much as we could, but not to worry her. So I was constantly trying to find that balance between being upfront with her, but not frightening her. Yeah. So we said, no, that's not going to work if we're going to be away for days. Yeah. So what we told her, we somehow managed to get it together and sort of explain that her brother had we found a mark on his back. It could be a bruise. He could have hurt himself, but we don't know how he's hurt himself. So Daddy and I have to go home and look at the house and do a really good check of the house to see if there's anything that could have hurt him. And it might take, a few days, so it's better if you stay with your grandparents. And she was quite happy with that. And I was quite proud of that explanation, as a way of including her, but not,
Especially when you've had no support.
Either. Yeah. In how to navigate that. So, so they went back. This bit's a bit hazy for me, actually, but it was just like we're in a black hole, totally helpless. We were going back and forth to see them. Yeah. I was expressing milk when I could, but that was quite difficult, probably in the stressful
I was going to say, the stress you must have felt.
Yeah, so I think he ended up having bits of formula. Yeah. But by some miracle, we managed to carry on breastfeeding until he was 10 months old, which is just amazing, in the circumstances. So, credit to him as well. But so had a review. Yeah, so my daughter had an assessment where they asked her some questions. They looked for bruises, but they kept it. We were able to be there. They kept it quite light, and that was okay. She didn't really think much of it. But it was totally unnecessary, putting her in that position that was not needed. Again, in hindsight, with what could have prevented it. So at about day 8, I think, of this process, we were invited back for a review. Okay. We flagged that to the hospital. We flagged that the bruise hadn't changed, so could we revisit the idea that it's a birthmark? At that day, he put an urgent referral to dermatology, who confirmed it within about 20 minutes.
Wow.
And the dermatologist was obviously frustrated as well that we'd had to go through this. But it didn't quite end there, because we had to wait another 2 days because they were getting a second opinion on this x-ray from Alder Hay. Took another 2 days to come back to us and say, it was an error on the x-ray. So neither of those things were what they suspected, and at that point we could go home, and that was that. But it wasn't that, because we were left very upset by the whole thing. And it affected me for a long time afterwards, actually, and still, to be honest, when it comes to like the anniversary of that time, it was just before Christmas as well, unfortunately, but I start to think back, not voluntarily, but it comes back. This year I'd say has been the easiest so far. It is diminishing, but this year I actually wrote to the doctor again and said, I just felt the need to let you know how much it's affected me ongoing. Each year I think of it, and each year it's really difficult, and I've been quite angry. And anyway, to his credit, he replied the same day and said, I've learned a lot from your case, and please be assured that it affected me too, and we've made changes. But the bit that I've missed out is that we did make a formal complaint to both healthcare and social care, listing the many things, unfortunately, that we feel could have made the situation easier. Not least the initial diagnosis. That was, for me, crucial, and would have saved, as I say, resources, stress, trauma, the impact on the kids, all of that. Despite the slightly atypical presentation, the fact that it was a bit later, and the fact that we were white, but we were able to find information on the internet quite easily that showed that it's possible, and the pictures that we found were so similar on Google Images. We don't need a medical degree to do a bit of Googling, and we found our answers. But we were just we felt like our hands were tied, because we were going through this assessment as well. We couldn't cause too much of a fuss, or we didn't want to. My dad was in the background saying, like, just stand up for yourselves. And I was like, but it's so hard.
I imagine it's really hard in that situation, because you want to follow the process because you've not done anything wrong, and you don't want them, I guess, to think you're trying to cover something up, and you just want to help, and you yourself want to find out what's going on, but at the same time you're kind of trapped, I guess. And it's like you said before, powerless. I feel like that's a really poignant word to your circumstance, what happened, because that's exactly what you were.
And I think, just mentioning my dad then, he was really, he wanted the best for us, and when I say stand up for yourself, absolutely, and that's normally what I would have done. And I'm quite assertive when it comes to things like this, hence making the complaints afterwards. I am, when I think things aren't being done in the right way, I am assertive, especially having worked in the NHS. I know how I was taught to treat people, and that wasn't always happening. But even amidst all of that, with all our privilege, really, you know, and we are able to speak up for ourselves. English is our first language, you know. I have a husband to support me as well. There's so many people in different situations. We had a family, as I say. My dad was really concerned for us, and that's why he was worried, and it affected the wider family, you know, and people just watching us go through it, and they've probably felt very powerless as well. But even with all that support and the voice that we do have, we still felt like that. So I get upset at this bit thinking about all the people that haven't got that, you know, maybe on their own as a single parent, and that's just, my heart breaks for them. So.
And the first thing that I kind of was going through in my mind, because obviously we've had a chat before this episode and you've told me a little bit about what happened, is the thing of there's all these children that are being abused and hurt that just don't, they're not on the radar at all, and they have to endure that. But then there's people like you, and this has happened.
Resources are being used,
no reason. It didn't need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And also what I think often is children who do need help, if we were treated like this, their parents may be struggling and done something they regret, or, you know, there's so many shades of grey within situations. And if we were treated like this and we did absolutely nothing, if people who are just really struggling and don't know what to do get treated in the same way or worse, you know, when there has been some evidence of harm. Because my belief passionately is that even, and this is what we were taught, I worked in children's mental health, we were taught to remain curious at all times and non-judgemental and be collaborative, you know, no matter what you think may or may not have happened, there's always lots of different stories to take into account. And even if it turns out someone has done something maliciously, still, by keeping people on board and collaborating with you as a healthcare or social care team, is going to be the best outcome for the child, even if that outcome is that you can't look after them anymore, you know. You need to keep conversations going no matter what's happened. So that's the only way you're going to get the best for the kids, you know, and the parents, of course, but where the children have been harmed, that is still the only way you're going to get near to the truth, and you're going to get, therefore, the best decisions about what to do next. But where people feel accused and judged and, you know, then you're not going to get those results.
It's like the whole thing as well of, so how did that affect your experience of motherhood the second time around? Because obviously when that's happened, you were a very new mum.
So that he's my second. But it definitely tarnished that first year, really, you know, in terms of, but it's actually more complicated than that, because so I try to, I feel like my interactions with my son weren't affected too much by that. I was very conscious, I did a lot of self-reflection, I tried to get support. I feel like I was still able to be, you know, a good mum. But what made things more complicated is that shortly after that, my mum was diagnosed with cancer. So within about a month, I think, maybe 6 weeks, and then she died 3 months later. So that, straight after this had happened, we were thrown into another really traumatic situation. So I think those things combined made for a really, really difficult few years, really.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, my next question was going to be like, so after all that happened and, you know, it's confirmed it was a bruise and stuff, where did you kind of go from there? But obviously you've just kind of been dropped out of one situation and then straight into the next.
Yeah, I mean, we pursued the complaints, you know, despite all that, because we felt like that was so important, not for us only, but for people in the future. So we felt that was a priority, despite navigating my mum's situation as well, with the same hospital. So that was interesting, you know, having to go past the ward again and on a regular basis to visit my mum, and, you know.
And how did that make you feel?
Oh, that was difficult, because obviously in some ways it was almost like good, because I just had to access health services again, you know, like quickly, and I didn't like have a big gap where I built it up in my mind, or the trauma embedded in that way, you know, just not being able to go near the building or anything. I just had to do it. But I was conscious of the very real potential of bumping into the staff that we'd, you know, encountered. As I say, not all staff, of course. A lot of the nurses particularly were just very objective with us and just got on with things, kind, you know. But it was sort of key people that were difficult to engage with sometimes. But so we pursued the complaints. We were satisfied with the responses. I think we met with senior people, and obviously they have like a patient PAL service, the patient liaison, people who sort of led on that, I think, if my memory's right. But it went to independent people to oversee and sort of pick through what happened. We were able to ask specific questions about our care, what had happened, why things had happened, why things hadn't happened. And we got a comprehensive reply from healthcare. Social care wasn't so comprehensive, I'd say. We did get a meeting with someone more senior who acknowledged what we'd been through and said that she would take it back and it would inform training, and she would liaise. We didn't get a chance to meet with our particular team again. But after, I felt like the healthcare complaints procedure was a little bit better managed overall, and we got a more satisfactory response. They told us exactly what they were going to do differently, and that they'd informed various teams about, you know, our experience and what needs to change. So a couple of the big takeaways was that the doctor, whilst he said he'd never seen anything quite like this, he acknowledged that it's now informed their practice. They've shared it within doctors' learning events and all of that kind of thing. I still have a big question about why, even if there was the slightest suggestion it could have been that, why we weren't referred to dermatology on day one. Even if it was not quite typical, we were able to find it online, as I say, so why wasn't that rushed through?
To some people listening, they might kind of hear, you know, a week and think, a week, but if you think about when you're in that situation, I imagine a week felt like a year. Yeah,
and I think that's right. I think reading back on the response we got from healthcare, a lot of it does read like all this happened, you know, a lot happened in a week almost, and we were doing what we could, but a week to them is nothing. A week when you're going it was actually 11 days in total, because we had to wait those extra couple of days for that x-ray second opinion, but 11 days to them goes by very quickly. They've got many cases to consider, so to them the emotional connection isn't there. They're busy, they're stressed as well often, but to us it felt like a year. It was just, but I think the thing for us was we didn't know how long it was going to go on for. So while in hindsight it was 11 days, but actually we thought, we read cases online that lasted months because he couldn't figure out, so not birthmark cases necessarily, but where there'd been unexplained bruises, things had dragged on because they still didn't know what had happened, and we were fearful that if it was a bruise, that could happen, that it could drag on and on. After 5 days or so, we were fairly confident it wasn't that, and it was a birthmark. But again, that could have been rushed through at that point. There was lots of points it could have shortened that hell for us. So that was a big thing. So maybe now they've learned from that, and that there's different presentations and that they can appear a bit later, etc. And whilst earlier I mentioned the Mongolian Blue Spot, and whilst that name isn't used anymore, I think it's important to name it now, because I think hopefully in text for the podcast and stuff people can Google, because we found that really helpful, because that was mentioned by the GP. This is the other thing, the GP said, oh, it could be, but it doesn't look a typical one. Again, she mentioned it.
And it's like, if your GP in that very first instance has mentioned that,
why wasn't it ruled out?
Yeah.
At that point, it would have been ruling it out in their mind, but actually they would have found that it would have confirmed it, preventing a lot of heartache. So that's a big step in the diagnostic procedure that I hope has changed. Another big thing is support for breastfeeding mums, particularly. But even if I hadn't been breastfeeding, apparently they admitted that they were wrong in sending me home that first night. They shouldn't have done that, because we weren't under a police protection order, or there's certain things that do warrant separating parents, but the safeguarding lead got involved in our case and said, no, that was wrong. Ward staff need to be more aware of the procedures, and I could have stayed, perhaps with even a family member staying to supervise, but they could have got around it, could have been creative, but no, they were just like, no, you need to go, because we haven't got any staff to supervise. That's what they said, I think. Risking the whole breastfeeding process. There wasn't a lot of sensitivity around the breastfeeding thing, which was really important to us, and it's a human right. According to the UN, that's what I discovered, and that's what I put in the complaint. So there's a lot around that, and procedures. And for me, a huge thing is how we were advocated for, or we didn't have much access to support, to advocacy, to written information about the procedure, the processes, the assessment. There was nothing really like that. And that for me is awful, just to not be supported through it.
And it's like you mentioned before, like obviously you got your husband, and you were looking up things and stuff, and not to take away from your situation at all, but I could imagine there'll be other parents in a similar situation that don't have that, or they kind of can't access stuff, or don't know how to, where does that leave them?
Or aren't as confident to ask questions, or maybe have had bad experiences before, we couldn't have had any other sort of more access, really to, so the failing was really in what they could have provided to support us through that. And because I don't think we could have done any more for ourselves at that point. So for me, that process, so I guess that for the healthcare side and the social care side, that's my big advice to anyone listening who works in health and social care. There's two things. The first thing is what I said before about being curious, non-judgemental, supportive, no matter what, because that's the only way you're going to get, the best results for everybody, and to the truth. And secondly, to support people through the process in whatever way they need. Ask them what they need. Do you need written information? Do you need internet links? Do you need advocacy? Or, and have that available. I know it's not always available, but just explain that you're even thinking about that. We understand this is a really difficult process and a confusing process. It's something they do every day, but for someone coming in, it's horrible and baffling and lonely, and so that would be my two things.
And I think that's a really important point you've made there, and something I say quite a lot is like, you only know what you know about And so obviously the healthcare and social care professionals are going to know.
Yeah.
You know, it's even down to like terminology and stuff like that, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I felt, and just like, you know, Section 47 and all these safeguarding terms, and we didn't know what actually that meant in practice, and what our rights were ultimately. Like, I kept thinking that at the time, what are our rights? What can we push again? You know, almost, because we felt like we were being pushed on, but what were we able to say? Actually, no, that's not okay. Without being accused of being obstructive or, you know. So there was all of that. Our rights needed to be clearly explained in that situation. I know we weren't under a police protection order, but felt like it, you know, it felt like we did see the police on that first night, and they were actually pretty supportive, you know, like they were, they were probably one of the most supportive on that first evening. But acknowledged that it was really a health and social care issue, so we need to go through them for a lot of our questions, but they did what they could to answer our questions. I remember vaguely. It was a bit of a blur, but and I think the advice to parents would be, as I say, ask questions where you can. Don't be afraid to ask questions, because, you know, you need to be curious as well and be assertive where you can, but accept that it's so difficult in this situation. But do what research you can, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do the podcast, because if people are Googling, we found it so helpful to find a bit of light at the end of the tunnel with regards to a couple of articles we found of parents who'd had the same birthmark in their child and been through a similar misidentification of it, and we thought, oh, maybe there's light at the end, you know. It's horrible in the short term, but we could see the end. We could be a bit more assertive in our requests for checks at that point. Not that it really helped massively, but that so again, just to raise awareness of this birthmark that can be confused and cause short-term devastating effects. I think just something I read about recently, because I'm still involved in healthcare myself in some bits of my work. And I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about how services should be done with patients, clients, service users, not to. You know, and that really resonated thinking about this story. It's like with, not to, you know, that's and no matter what the situation, even if you think a child is at risk, it's still working with, you know. And the point of, you said before about children not having access to services who need it, you know, I think the reason why babies so young are prioritised is because they don't have a voice, you know, and they almost take that responsibility as health and social care. They're like, right, this baby doesn't have a voice, then there's something happened, we need to, you know, put all our resources into finding it, but overzealously on this occasion. So we are the voice, the parents, you know. You really need to keep us involved, empowered, and on board, and in conversation, and done with sensitivity, you know, which was lacking on occasions, a lot of occasions, not always, as I said. And I just think one other thing I really want to say actually is that I don't want people to be put off from going to see their GPs, because obviously if you've got concerns about your child, and we did, and I would do the same again, you know, even because at that moment we didn't know what it was. You know, we just saw a mark. We thought, oh, it could be a clotting issue. You know, we didn't know. And where you don't know, you have to ask. You have to ask those questions for the benefit of your child, you know, and that's what takes precedence in that moment. And I just hope that this conversation can go towards helping that process for everyone, really.
Well, thank you for sharing your, I don't really want to call it a story, because it's not a story, is it? It's your experience of what's happened, but thank you for sharing that with us. And I think it takes a lot of courage to come on a podcast anyway, but it takes a lot of courage to come on and talk about a situation like that caused so much trauma and affected your family how it did. But I also think, like you've mentioned on the reason for doing this podcast, is that's why it's important to have conversations like this. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to follow, share with other parents you know, and if you haven't already, please leave a review on the app that you're listening on. A new episode is released every Monday. Follow or subscribe to be notified when each new episode goes live. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, please get in touch via any of my social media channels, website or email. Thank you to our guests for joining me on today's episode. It's been great to have you, and thank you to everyone for listening.